Lieutenant Callum Reyes steadied himself in the narrow confines of Orpheus as their destination loomed closer. The planet Tau Ceti 5 sat before them, a desolate world dimly lit by the pale yellow light of a distant star. Beside him, his team sat in tense silence. There was something unnerving about investigating a colony that had gone silent, especially this far from home. "Command confirmed," Reyes said, breaking the quiet. "The last contact was 15 months ago. The colony was fully stocked and equipped for at least 5 years without outside support." He paused, glancing at each face in the dim light of the cabin. Jada, their communications officer; Mara, the team's medic; Sergeant Lee, their muscle; and Carter, the tech specialist. "This is just another equipment failure," Reyes added, trying to convince himself as much as the others. "We go in, assess and report. It's probably just a broken transmitter." The others nodded, but the tension remained. Everyone had heard the stories. Stations, outposts, colonies, facilities in deep space that lost contact and never returned a signal. Many were written off as technical failures or human error. Yet, some were rumored to have disappeared without a trace, as if something in the blackness swallowed them whole. The Orpheus touched down with a subtle thud, and the team moved quickly. Outside, Tau Ceti 5's barren surface stretched in all directions, dotted by the abandoned structures of the mining colony. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that sank into your bones. Reyes took a deep breath, feeling the first pangs of doubt. "All right," he said, checking his wrist scanner. "We're splitting into 2 teams. Lee, Mara, you're with me. We'll head to the main hub and check for logs or any trace of personnel. Jada, Carter, you 2 take the east side. Look for the power relays and see if you can figure out what's shut down." Jada and Carter nodded, disappearing into the dusty haze with their gear. Reyes adjusted his helmet and led his team toward the central building. As they approached, the dull throb of their footsteps echoed through the empty compound, the only sound to pierce the silence. Inside, the main facility was a picture of sudden abandonment. Equipment lay scattered across desks, half-filled cups sat on tabletops, and data pads lay untouched as though someone had just set them down and never returned. Reyes felt a chill run up his spine. For a year, this place had waited, frozen in the moment it was deserted. "Lee, start with the terminals. Mara, check for any kind of physical evidence. Journals, personal logs." Reyes began searching the nearest console, and after a few minutes of sifting through corrupt files, he managed to access a brief log entry. The entry was dated a few days before the last known transmission. "We've heard noises," Reyes read aloud. "The miners say it's nothing, just seismic activity. But I'm not convinced. Shadows in the mines. Whispers. Feels like someone else is here." He glanced over at Lee and Mara, both of whom had stopped what they were doing, listening intently. "Seismic activity, my ass," Lee muttered. "More like they found something they shouldn't have." Before Reyes could respond, Jada's voice crackled over the comms. "Lieutenant, we've got something weird here. Looks like recent footprints near the power relays. There's dust everywhere, but these are fresh." "Copy that," Reyes replied, his pulse quickening. "Any sign of the colonists?" "No," Jada replied, her voice taut. "But something doesn't feel right. It's like we're being watched." Reyes nodded to Mara and Lee, who joined him by the entrance. "We're heading back your way," he said into the comms. As they left the facility, the wind picked up slightly, stirring the dust around them. Reyes cast a look over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. They regrouped with Jada and Carter by the power relays, and Carter led them to the footprints. Sure enough, fresh tracks cut through the dust, trailing toward a dark entrance to the mine shaft that stretched deep below the surface. It was wide enough for mining vehicles, its walls jagged and unfinished. "What's the call, Lieutenant?" Jada asked, eyeing the darkness. Reyes took a moment to consider. "We go in," he said finally, "but we stay together. Lee, take point." Lee nodded, and with their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness, they descended. The silence inside the tunnel felt even heavier than the desolation above ground, the oppressive weight of the rock pressing down on them. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering as their beams scanned the passage. Just as Reyes was about to suggest turning back, a soft whisper echoed from deeper in the tunnel. He froze, heart pounding. His mind scrambled to rationalize it, to dismiss it as wind or an audio glitch in his helmet. But as he glanced at his team, he saw the terror in their eyes. Everyone had heard it. "What was that?" Mara's voice was barely a whisper. No one answered. As they pressed forward, the whisper returned, a low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. It wrapped around them, pulling them deeper into the darkness. Reyes clenched his jaw. He had promised command they would find answers. But in that moment, staring into the shadows that seemed to move and breathe, he felt the pull of an ancient, silent terror. And he understood why sometimes they didn't come back. The whispering persisted, faint but unmistakable, a sinister melody of sounds that didn't belong in an empty tunnel. Lieutenant Reyes forced himself to stay focused, gripping his flashlight tighter as he led the team deeper into the mine. Shadows flickered across the walls, each one stretching and contorting as if alive. Behind him, Jada broke the silence. "Lieutenant, do you hear that?" Her voice was strained, almost fearful. Reyes nodded, though he didn't look back. "Everyone stay close," he ordered, his voice calm but tense. He could feel the unease creeping through his team, spreading like a sickness. They had all felt watched since arriving, but in the depths of this mine, that feeling intensified. The darkness seemed to press against them, whispering secrets in a language they couldn't understand. As they continued forward, the tunnel opened into a wider chamber. The team paused, their flashlights sweeping the cavernous space, illuminating scattered mining equipment and piles of abandoned tools. In the center of the room lay a tablet, its screen cracked but functional. Reyes picked it up, glancing through the entries. "Looks like the miners kept logs here," he murmured, skimming through hastily written entries. Most were mundane, equipment failures, rough work schedules, until he found one that made his blood run cold. Entry 15, "We've seen shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. Heard things too. Whispers. The guys are getting spooked. I tell them it's nothing, just the wind through the tunnels, but I don't know. It's like something's in here with us." He shared the entry with the others. They were hearing the same things we're hearing, he said. Whatever it was, it terrified them. Lee frowned. "So they just left everything behind and vanished?" Reyes shook his head, unwilling to speculate. "We don't know that yet. But something pushed them to abandon their posts." Suddenly, Jada gasped, her flashlight catching movement near the far side of the room. The team spun, weapons raised, but saw nothing except the same oppressive shadows. "Did anyone else see that?" she whispered. "I saw it too," Carter said, his voice tight. "Looked like someone moving." A chill spread through Reyes. He knew the mind played tricks in darkness, but this felt different. The air seemed to throb, thick and heavy, as though something unseen was pressing in on them. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave this place to its silence and shadows. But then a voice broke through the quiet, a familiar voice, low and garbled. "Lieutenant Reyes, is that you?" It was Sergeant Lee. Except Lee was right there, standing beside Reyes, pale with confusion. "What?" Lee's eyes widened and he took a step back. "That's my voice." Reyes held up a hand, signaling for silence. The voice called out again, echoing from somewhere deeper in the mine. "I think I found them. I'm not alone." The team stood frozen, hearts pounding as they strained to listen. The voice trailed off into silence, leaving only the oppressive weight of the dark. And then, without warning, the lights began to flicker. In that pulsing darkness, the whispers grew louder, surrounding them from every angle. Reyes felt his grip on reality slipping, his mind struggling to process the voices, the shifting shadows. He could feel the terror rising within him, knowing something was in this darkness with them. And whatever it was, it didn't want them to leave. The lights sputtered and dimmed, casting the mine in a disorienting, strobe-like glow. Each flash revealed glimpses of shadowy figures around the edges of the chamber, vanishing just as quickly as they appeared. Lieutenant Reyes gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm as he scanned the area. "Stay close," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. His team huddled tighter, their faces pale and tense as they gripped their weapons, darting glances at the surrounding darkness. The whispering, low and guttural, echoed around them, blending with the rhythmic hum of their faltering lights. Then Mara broke, stepping back and nearly tripping over a discarded mining tool. Her eyes were wide, darting toward a particular shadow that seemed to writhe on its own. I keep hearing them. They're saying things, Reyes. They know us, they know our names." "Mara, hold it together," Reyes said, his voice firm but reassuring. He'd seen this before in high-stress missions, the mind playing tricks, feeding off fear. But here, those tricks felt more real, more visceral, as though the darkness itself were alive and reaching for them. Suddenly, Carter stumbled forward, his flashlight shaking in his grip. "Lieutenant, look." He pointed to a spot on the wall where strange symbols had been carved into the rock. They were erratic, almost alien, twisting in unnatural shapes that seemed to shift as the light passed over them. "Miners didn't carve these," Carter whispered, voice trembling. "It's like something else was here." Reyes examined the symbols, feeling a prickling unease settle over him. They looked like no language he'd ever seen, but something about them felt familiar, as if they were scratching at a primal part of his brain. He tore his gaze away, focusing back on his team. They were rattled and he needed to get them out of here. We've seen enough. Let's backtrack and regroup on the surface. We'll report this in and let command handle it, Reyes ordered, keeping his voice steady. But as they turned to leave, a familiar voice drifted from deeper in the tunnel, soft, pleading. Lieutenant, don't leave me. The voice was unmistakably Mara's. Reyes froze, glancing to his side to see Mara standing right there, her eyes wide with confusion. That's my voice, she whispered, her breath hitching. The voice called out again, echoing through the twisting tunnels. Please, don't leave me alone. A look of horror spread across Mara's face as she took a step back, shaking her head. No, that's not me. That's not me. Reyes felt a sick, twisting sensation in his gut. Whatever was down here, it wasn't just mimicking their voices, it was taunting them, pulling them deeper. We keep moving. Now, he said, his voice ironclad. But as they turned, the lights flickered one last time and went out entirely, plunging them into darkness. He reached out blindly, feeling the cold, damp walls, his breath shallow. The whispers surged again, louder now, a cacophony of overlapping voices echoing from every direction. Mara, Carter, Jada, Reyes called, his voice swallowed by the dark. In the inky black, he felt hands grasping at him. Not his team, but something colder, hungrier, pulling him further into the shadows. Lieutenant Reyes stumbled through the darkness, disoriented, his breathing shallow and ragged. He strained to hear his team's voices, but the silence that pressed around him was unnatural, thickened by the sense that something else was listening. Only the faintest traces of light came from his flashlight, its beam flickering weakly. Mara? Carter? His voice echoed back, warped, swallowed by the walls. He tried the comms again, but they only hissed with static. His heart pounded as he realized he was alone. He strained to recall the path they'd taken in, but the tunnels seemed to twist and shift around him, each turn looking identical to the last. Every few steps, he thought he saw shadows moving just out of reach, flitting into cracks in the rock, disappearing as soon as he turned. He took a shuddering breath, forcing himself to focus. His training, his instincts, none of it felt useful down here. His only guide was the faint hum that seemed to pulse through the walls, vibrating faintly beneath his fingertips. Then a voice echoed down the tunnel, a familiar voice. Lieutenant Reyes, is that you? It was Carter, distant but clear. Reyes surged forward, his pulse quickening. Carter. I'm coming to you, hold on. He rushed down the tunnel, the light dancing erratically as his heart raced with a glimmer of hope. But as he rounded a corner, he skidded to a halt. There, in the middle of the tunnel, was Carter, or something that looked like him, standing motionless, his eyes vacant. The figure's face was pale, lifeless, yet it held Reyes's gaze with an eerie intensity. Lieutenant, it whispered, lips barely moving. You shouldn't have come here. A chill crawled up Reyes's spine. He took a step back, realizing with horror that this was no longer his teammate. The figure's eyes remained fixed, unblinking, as though it were studying him. Where's my team? Reyes demanded, fighting the panic rising in his throat. The thing that wore Carter's face tilted its head, almost mockingly. They're here with me. They belong to me now. Its voice twisted, growing darker, layered with voices he recognized. Mara's, Jada's, even his own. In that moment Reyes understood. The entity, whatever it was, had lured them here, mimicking their voices, distorting their senses, feeding on their fear. It was no longer just a matter of escaping. This presence had anchored itself within the very walls, making the mind an endless trap. He took a step back, his hand shaking as he raised his flashlight. You can't keep us here, he said, though the conviction in his voice faltered. He had come here to rescue his team, yet he was the one caught, as helpless as those who'd vanished before him. The figure smiled, the expression hollow and wrong. Sometimes they don't come back, it said, before fading into the shadows. Reyes turned and ran, each step heavy, dragging through the dark. But with each tunnel he took, every twisting path, he found himself looping back to the same spot, to the same darkness that felt as endless as it was malevolent. With trembling hands he activated his last transmission to command, his voice barely a whisper. Stay away, he said. Sometimes, they don't come back. As he fell to his knees, the whispers closed in, swallowing his last words as the darkness took him.